On to center pivots. Center pivots for installation. First of all, we have to be able to develop a pivot point, make a pivot point. So that means we're going to have to pour a pivot pad. So we're going to go out there, frame up a pivot pad, and pour the cement for it. Generally, they're about 6 yards of cement with a rebar structure in them. Each pivot manufacturer has their way of doing it, but generally you're going to have a rebar around the perimeters embedded in the concrete, oftentimes a cross of rebar through the middle of the pad, and also rebar down in the corners, because quite often the corners are poured deeper than the pad itself, so that you basically have 4 anchors. Each corner is about a cubic yard of cement with a couple of yards poured over the surface as a finished surface to get the bulk and also to have a nice clean surface to work on to build your pivot. So you end up with about 6 yards, which weighs about 12 tons. So you got a heck of an anchor in there. When you finish that concrete, you never want to go in and put a slick finish on it. You know, you're not going to want this to be like your basement floor, because it'll be so slick you won't be able to stand on it when you get it wet. And especially when you get a little algae or other organisms growing on it, that thing will be like a skating rink. So you screed them off and at best broom finish it. Oftentimes these things, they just run the screed across them a couple of times with the board that you work the concrete to get it level. You just work it across there a couple of times and walk away. That's good enough. You want a really rough finish so that nobody's going to be slipping when they're standing on it. Now, also the way the pivot anchors down to it is quite variable. Some will put a bolt in each corner tied into the rebar, and so you set the pivot point and you have to have those bolts centered perfectly in each corner so that the thing sets right down on it when you're building it. A lot of the companies simply use chains, and then they'll tie down with turnbuckles to the chains that come up out of the concrete. So you expose 4 or 5 lengths of heavy chain and then put a turnbuckle on it and tight, and the turnbuckle then is anchored to each leg of the pivot. Most pivots have 4 legs, and you end up with 4 turnbuckles sucking them down. Some pivots have a tripod instead of 4 legs, so you'll have 3 legs and a little different looking pad. That is the anchor to keep the pivot in place. Then you simply build the superstructure on that for the standard to start hooking the pivot up to. And it's like a giant erector set. You just follow the book on how to build it. Bolt A goes into hole A. Nut A goes on bolt A, and so on. And then it'll tell you also the minimum torques that each one of those should have on them. And you have to be careful. Some of those nuts and bolts will be better grade than others. They'll require more strength, so they might be grade 5 bolts or grade 8 bolts and nuts, so you have to be aware of that. Realizing that there are differences in the strength of bolts and nuts that you can put on the system. Also, it may require a certain torque that the bolts be set to, so that they'll have a minimum amount of torque required, so that you won't have those nuts backing off over a season. Realizing we're putting these systems into a very hostile environment. It's wet all the time, it gets huge temperature changes, and it's dirty all the time. The potential for blowing dust and the like, and then the grit in the water, we're putting corrosives on it, putting down fertilizer and other chemicals. They're going to try to attack that metal. So we're putting them in a very hostile environment, and so we have, in some cases, have to consider a little bit of oversizing, which the manufacturer's done, and certain tensions so that these things, oh, also because it's moving, it's vibrating. And the wind that blows across the surface of these things up in the air like that, they're shaking all the time, even when they're not running. So we get a lot of vibration that's trying to work those nuts off the bolts. Most often you're going to find lots of those nuts are self-locking. They have a material in the threads to lock and seize them up, or they will have a slight oval surface to them so that they're really hard to put on and really hard to take off. Obviously you need power tools to put these things together, otherwise you'll be out there forever. So you need a ratchet out there, either electric or pneumatic power tools to put this thing together. Impact wrenches of some kind are the name of the game.